over the death of George Floyd. In Minneapolis and St. Paul, a full mobilization of the state's National Guard, with officials blaming the chaos on outsiders.
Looking to cause violence in our communities.
Looting in Los Angeles, riot police out in force. Cars in Chicago set ablaze and officers beaten. Large protests in New York City and on the doorstep of President Trump, who is defending his supporters.
By the way, they love African-American people. MAGA loves black people.
The violence in the streets leading to hundreds of arrests, leaving despair in the wake of destruction.
These people are tearing up our livelihood.
Our ABC News team on the ground in Minneapolis.
We're not going anywhere!
And across the country with the latest developments.
Good morning on a wrenching Sunday in America. Whit and I are right here in New York City. Eva right there on the scene in Minneapolis.
And overnight, the protests escalating across the country over George Floyd, who died after nearly 9 minutes with his neck under the knee of a Minneapolis police officer.
Nearly 1,700 arrests in 22 cities overnight. This as more than a dozen cities declare curfews and call in the National Guard.
And it's happening against the backdrop of a pandemic with large crowds and some people not wearing masks. Let's get right to Eva, where it all started in Minneapolis. And Eva, what's the situation there on the ground right now?
Well, this is the scene that people in cities all across America are waking up to this morning. There were protests here again last night. The National Guard was out trying to keep people off the streets, keeping things relatively under control. But that was not the case in many cities. We have team coverage across the country. Let's start with Matt Gutman in Los Angeles. Good morning, Matt.
Hey, good morning, Eva. You know, just a few moments ago, I saw police arrest someone who was looting. It's still going on at this very hour, even early in the morning. And above the screaming of alarms here, you may be able to see just the incredible mess that's been left behind here in Los Angeles. Broken glass everywhere, the shoe boxes. Now, what distinguishes what happened yesterday from so many protests historically in cities like Los Angeles is that protesters took it right to the very heart of privilege. Beverly Hills, just a couple of miles away. Stores like this, Fight Club, which sell $1,000 sneakers. Last night seemed very different.
Overnight fiery unrest coast to coast. Demands for justice erupting into spasms of rioting and looting from New York City, where these cruisers were set aflame, to Los Angeles, where mass looting took place, and dozens of cities in between. In Nashville, the historic City Hall set ablaze. The National Guard called out to try to tame the unrest. And in Los Angeles Saturday, the demonstrations beginning in downtown, then sprawling across the city.
We're not going anywhere!
One of them going to the symbols of privilege in America, Beverly Hills Rodeo Drive. There, an intense standoff.
So they're starting to fire. They're starting to fire using shotguns to fire what appear to be pellets or beanbags of some sort. They're trying to move the crowd back.
This police car set ablaze as police tried to push back demonstrators.
This isn't the answer. And honest to God, we've made our point.
Early on, police telling ABC News that protests were mostly civil, but on the peripheries, those skirmishes gave way to looting. Right there on Rodeo Drive, looters smashing into luxury stores.
That's a Target back there, and you can see them hauling out a big screen TV.
No police in sight, and seemingly everywhere, police overwhelmed. In Seattle, 2 AR-15 rifles taken from a police car. A quick-thinking security guard grabs one rifle and removes the magazine. In Chicago, more cars set on fire, police raising the bridges, clashes breaking out there. And one group of people seen on camera beating 3 officers before other protesters put themselves in harm's way to stop the violence. In Indianapolis, that situation turning deadly amid escalating violence, that gunfire breaking out, killing at least one person. And on the East Coast, dozens arrested after a violent night in Atlanta. Crowds facing off with authorities, police saying an officer hit by an ATV speeding through the streets.
Now, the past couple of nights, we have seen some of the worst looting in this city's history. And as fire trucks roll by everywhere where we look, the question is how many more nights like this are anticipated? And law enforcement tells us at this point, they have no idea where this is going to go. Guys.
Matt Gutman for us there in Los Angeles. In New York City, protests were held in several neighborhoods with more than 345 arrests and attacks on at least 15 police vehicles. ABC's Zachary Quiche has more for us. Good morning, Zachary.
Eva, good morning to you. The street sweepers have been running back and forth on 14th Street trying to clean up what has been a messy situation. And just behind me here is Union Square, which is typically a melting pot. Last night it was really ground zero, or the center point of this conflict between the community and the police. You're seeing video now of some of these violent clashes happening. In many ways, this is the voice of hopelessness. You see folks taking over this police cruiser. That happened several times. Many interactions just like this. We're told that at least 30 cops were injured and at least 300 arrests were made. Protesters were out in response to the death of George Floyd for the second night here, but it can't be minimized that the hurt on some level is homegrown. There's Amadou Diallo, Ramarley Graham, Eric Gardner. There are issues right here in New York City, and I think the interconnectedness of this is what we're seeing across the country. Literally thousands of plaints here in New York City that have not been heard, and we saw some of that frustration come out. Now, the police are being criticized for some videos that are surfacing online in regards to their encounters with protesters. The mayor says police were put in an impossible situation. It should also be noted that the mayor campaigned on police reform, and many people here believe that hasn't happened. Eva?
All right, Zachary Quiche for us. The unrest extending to President Trump's doorstep. Protesters making their feelings loud and clear, demonstrating near the White House. ABC's Rachel Scott joins us from Washington with more. Good morning, Rachel.
Eva, good morning. The anger and frustration gripping the nation, spilling over right here into the president's front yard. You can see behind me as some of the crews start to try and clean up some of the debris and graffiti left here overnight. It was chaos in the nation's capital. Demonstrators circling the White House complex, some throwing bricks, rocks, and even fireworks, trying to rip barricades to get even closer. And as those crowds grew, the tensions escalated. The National Guard was activated to help park police. Parts of D.C. going up in flames, cars set on fire, some demonstrators vandalizing federal buildings, others looting stores overnight, many still gathering peacefully, trying to demand justice for George Floyd. And this is normally a section of D.C., Eva, where tourists gather, trying to get a glimpse of the White House. Last night, Secret Service set up these barricades, trying to create a buffer between those demonstrators and the gates of the White House. Some protesters determined to send a clear message to the president and the rest of the nation. One writing on a wall behind me, he was human too. Eva?
Rachel Scott, thank you. And guys, we are waking up this morning after seeing unrest from coast to coast. The country clearly at a tipping point. Dan.
As we said, a wrenching morning in America. Eva, thank you. We'll come back to you soon. Overnight, with those protests raging outside the White House, inside, President Trump was on Twitter threatening to retaliate with, in his words, vicious dogs and ominous weapons. ABC's Cecilia Vega is in Washington with more on that angle. Cecilia, good morning to you.
Hey, Dan, good morning to you. And he continued to tweet late into the night, praising law enforcement, blasting the mayor of Minneapolis, as the president himself, once again, during times of civil unrest in this country, is under fire for stoking division.
Overnight, that chaos erupting just steps from the White House. But a show of force by the president's Make America Great Again supporters did not happen. Earlier in the day, the president essentially inviting those supporters to show up, tweeting, "Tonight, I understand, is MAGA night at the White House." He later denied he was stoking racial tensions.
By the way, they love African American people. MAGA loves black people.
And in a tweet that critics said evoked images of civil rights era police sicking dogs on protesters, the president said nobody came close to breaching the fence. If they had, they would have been greeted with the most vicious dogs and most ominous weapons I have ever seen. Also in the president's line of fire, D.C.'s Democratic mayor. He accused her of not letting local police intervene in the protest outside the White House. But that false claim was quickly contradicted, not just by Washington officials, but also the president's own Secret Service, who said D.C. police were indeed very much part of the response.
What used to be heard in dog whistles, we now hear from a bullhorn.
And while President Trump said he did speak with George Floyd's family, Floyd's brother is now speaking out too, saying in that conversation he couldn't even get a word in.
It was so fast, he didn't give me the opportunity to even speak. It was hard. I was trying to talk to him, but he just kept pushing me off, I don't want to hear what you're talking about. And I just told him I want justice.
Okay, we're back now with Cecilia. Cecilia, I want to show you a headline from the New York Times this morning. It reads, "In days of discord, a president fans the flames." How different is this president's leadership style from what we're used to seeing from American presidents in times of crisis?
Well, completely different from other presidents, Dan, not so different from what we've seen from President Trump in the past. Let me just quickly recap for you a couple of the things that we've seen this week. We had that threat to shoot American citizens, essentially, in a tweet from the president when he said looting, the shooting starts, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. That was a reference to a 1960s era racist crackdown on black neighborhoods in Miami. In the face of widespread condemnation, he ultimately started to backtrack on that, but it took him 14 hours to do that. He said that he had been misinterpreted. As we saw cities burning across this country, the president held a Rose Garden event where he called it a press conference. He ended up not taking questions, and he walked out without at all addressing what was happening around the country, or let alone in Minneapolis. He has called these protesters mobs and thugs. And you'll go back a little bit. Remember Charlottesville? He said there were very fine people on both sides when we were talking about neo-Nazi protesters there. Dan, what we have seen time and time again from this president is that when we are talking about moments of civil unrest in this country, particularly moments like what we are living through right now with great racial tension and pain from coast to coast, we've seen a president who frankly has fanned the flames and capitalized on division rather than unity.
We are at such a difficult point in American history between this and the pandemic. Cecilia, we appreciate you covering every step of it. Cecilia Vega weighing in from Washington this morning. Whit, over to you.
And Dan, while many protesters are calling for real change, there is growing concern some are just taking advantage of a chaotic situation. ABC's Chief Justice correspondent Pierre Thomas joins us now from Washington. And Pierre, officials in Minnesota say about 80% of those arrested were from out of the state, and Attorney General Barr is issuing a stern warning.
Barr is saying that people who come from out of state will be prosecuted at the federal level. But let me walk folks through who are in these crowds in Minneapolis and some of these other major cities. The overwhelming majority of the protesters are demonstrating peacefully. The rioters include undisciplined locals. That may include younger people throwing debris and vandalizing. There are people who have criminal intent who want to steal and loot. And law enforcement officials say there are anarchists, anti-government operators from both the left and the right, and people who are using Antifa-style tactics. And we learn law enforcement intelligence is warning that white supremacists may also show up in an attempt to frame black people as violent offenders and sow the seeds of a race war. Whit.
And Pierre, you've covered issues of racial injustice in this country for many years, but give us some perspective on the significance of this moment and why it feels different this time.
But in some ways, this is similar to what we've seen in recent years in these kinds of moments. People are trying to exercise their right to free speech, to make change, and their anger is righteous. The root of all this is Mr. Floyd and the way that he died at the hands of police, unarmed and over a routine matter. This all stems from an allegation that Floyd used counterfeit cash to illegally buy some cigarettes. Police weren't responding to a violent crime, not a robbery, not a shooting in progress, not an assault. This is over counterfeit money and cigarettes, and the man is dead. And those images of how he died haunts us all. And it's not the first time a black man has been seriously injured or killed in similar circumstances. While the overwhelming majority of police do their job well and are here to serve and protect, this is about the ongoing issue of whether black people are treated as suspects first and citizens second. To that degree, we're still dealing with America's original sin, racism. What is new is that people are using social media to solicit violence and encourage people to go to places in real time. And we now even have foreign governments pushing disinformation onto social media to sow more division. So now law enforcement has to urgently figure out who's behind the violence and simultaneously deal with these ongoing and vexing issues of race and policing.
Not to mention, as we mentioned earlier, the backdrop of the pandemic. People don't necessarily have jobs or school to go back to. It's kind of the perfect storm of pain and despair. Pierre Thomas for us. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. Pierre, of course, will also be on This Week with Cecilia later on this morning. George also has House Speaker Nancy Pelosi as well. Plus, he speaks with Minnesota Congresswoman Ilhan Omar and President Trump's National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien about the nationwide protests. That's all coming up on This Week with George Stephanopoulos. For now, though, let's go back to Eva in Minneapolis.
Now back to a night of growing protests across the United States. Here in Minneapolis, where the incident that sparked this rage happened, the Minnesota National Guard was in place overnight to meet protesters. ABC's Alex Perez is also here in Minneapolis with me. Alex, good morning to you.
Hey, Eva, I want you to take a look at the scope of the damage here. It is not an exaggeration to say some parts of Minneapolis right now look like a war zone. Now, unlike nights before, last night authorities showed up with a full force, a massive force of manpower. They confronted protesters and arrested them. Overnight, clashes erupting on the streets of Minneapolis, police firing tear gas and rubber bullets at protesters, violating the city's curfew. Protesters met with the full force of the state's National Guard. For the first time in 164 years, Minnesota's governor mobilizing record force. The state capitol surrounded by heavily fortified armed Minnesota National Guardsmen alongside state patrols. Local law enforcement announcing they've been intercepting communications from extremist groups they believe are organizing protests using peaceful demonstrations as cover to cause deliberate mayhem.
You have somebody who will go forward and break a window or try to start a fire or something, then go run back behind the people who are trying to peacefully protest and use them essentially as human shields.
The Minneapolis mayor calling it domestic terrorism.
There are so many outside influences that are using peaceful community protesters as prey.
Officials asking everyone to stay home so they can better separate the peaceful protesters from the agitators, as this heartbroken community is desperately trying to pick up the pieces.
These people are tearing up our livelihood. This is the only place I could go to shop. And now I don't have anywhere to go. I don't have anywhere to get there.
And authorities here say that massive show of manpower is still in place, and at this point they do not believe they will need federal troops to step in. And Eva, I have to say, you know, we focus a lot on the severe damage because it is significant, but the other thing that is significant that it's sometimes hard to transmit is the sense of pain and anguish in the air. It is palpable. People are sick and tired of being sick and tired. Eva?
Alex, such a good point that you make this morning. People are hurting. And guys, you see all these protests in city after city all across this country. One thing is clear, and it's exactly what Alex is talking about. People want something to change. Something has to change. Dan and Whit.
It's so hard to see these images, too, of all this destruction behind you, Eva. But as Alex put it so perfectly, people are sick and tired, Dan, of being sick and tired.
Yeah, I think there's an undercurrent of so much pain and history coursing underneath all the events we're seeing right now, and it's really just bubbling through.
And Eva, we're going to talk to you in just a moment. First, though, we want to transition, get a check of the forecast with Rob Marciano. Rob, good morning to you.
Hey, good morning, Whit. Good morning, everybody. We'll turn our attention to the southwest, which had a heat wave this week to kind of dry the vegetation out. A little cooler now, but a human-caused blaze spawned evacuations just outside of Phoenix, just over 1,200 acres there, and they brought in the air support to try to get a handle on it. All right, here's the low that kind of cooled things off. It had a strong cold front with it. We had 80-plus mile-per-hour winds in central Oregon yesterday, and those strong storms now are pushing off towards the east as the cooler air begins to sink into the Intermountain West and pushes the more warm air into the Midwest. 70s today in Minneapolis, but near 90 tomorrow and Tuesday. 91 expected in Green Bay. That's toasty. Let's check on the national headlines weather-wise. Here now is your local forecast.
Hello and happy Sunday. A lot of sunshine today, clear blue skies this morning. I think that will be the case for the majority of the day. Low humidity, temperatures gradually rising into the low and mid 70s through the afternoon. Overall, a nice Sunday ahead of us. For your Monday, mid 70s again. We will have added clouds, chance for a few showers on your Tuesday. Check out Wednesday, 91 degrees. You see those storm chances. They return Wednesday through Saturday into the next weekend. Highs Thursday through Saturday in the upper 80s.
Westport, Connecticut, in honor of yesterday's successful launch of Americans from American soil into space.